translated Pratibha Rai's Adi Bhumi. In 2015, Professor Das has translated 19 stories from noted writer Das Venur's collection Kanduri and Other Stories. Professor Das is the author of Functional Grammar and Spoken and Written Communication in English. He has also written dictionaries like Wordmaster Learner's Dictionary in English, Expressway to English, which is an English dictionary for speakers of Hindi, and others. He has edited school educational books under the series title Orient Black Swan Easy Readers like The Two Friends, Moby Dick, The Naughty T-Shirt and Other Stories, and many others. I have always seen Professor Das as a person with a lot of zeal and passion for teaching. Whenever he has come to the Department of English, Ramadevi Women's University, to deliver a lecture, we have learned so much from him. It is a great privilege for us today to listen to such a notable academician, writer, and translator. Professor Das, please.
Thank you very much, Manisha, for that very kind introduction. And I must also thank Madhusmita. Let me first wish my invisible audience, invisible in the sense that I can't see you physically, although I can see some of you on the screen. Wherever you may be, I wish you a very good afternoon. And I must also thank the Ramadevi Women's University and its Vice Chancellor, as well as the Center of Excellence for Translation and Life Writing, and the coordinator, Professor Madhusmita Pati, for inviting me to speak. This university bears the name of one of Odisha's greatest daughters, known to us as Ma Ramadevi. Hers is an inspiring story. She has left behind an autobiography, which is one of the outstanding pieces of life writing in our language. Unfortunately, it has not yet, to my knowledge, been translated into any other language. And it is to be hoped that the center will sponsor translation of this work in at least the two languages, English and Hindi, through which great Odia writing can reach a wider readership. So we have to work through some filter language, such as English or Hindi. By a happy coincidence, the departments of Odia, Hindi, and English at this university are collaborating in the activities of the Translation Center. The letter of invitation which I received from the center a few weeks ago contained a brief summary of the center's objectives, which I found, I must confess, a little disappointing. Apparently, the center has decided to focus its activities on only some selected genres of writing, which have been called life writing. I had not heard this term before. These presumably include biography and autobiography, memoirs and reminiscences, travelogues, treatises on a range of subjects, essays and occasional writings, articles, excerpted from journals and newspapers, etc. These genres of writing could be described as objective or factual. One may expect a heavy emphasis also on the translation of scientific and technological writing.
Sorry, sir, you are not audible. Sir, you are just not audible, sir.
Okay. Am I more audible now?
Yes, you're audible now.
The center seems to have excluded literary and creative. Is that okay? Madhusmita, is that okay now? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir. We can hear you now.
They have excluded literary and creative texts from the category of life writing. The rationale for the exclusion is not clear, since the lines separating literary from non-literary texts are often blurred. I have recently translated an Odia book with the title Pagadi Purusha. Its author describes the book as a biographical novel, combining elements of two genres that are generally kept apart: biography and fiction. The narrative is based on some episodes from the life of Madhusudan Das, 1848 to 1934, who is known to every child in Odisha, but seems to be unknown outside our state. Most biographers indulge in some embroidery of the truth, although they're not supposed to deviate from established facts. If we exclude biography from the category of life writing, on the ground that the writer has exercised his imagination, we will be losing something of value. In fact, the whole question of what is truth and what is fiction is relevant to the definition of translation. You may be wondering why this talk has been given the title Translating Odisha. This happens to be the title of a recent book published by a well-known professor of translation who has been a regular visitor to Odisha over the past 4 decades. Although he has used the title to introduce an important section of his book, it is mostly devoted to the translation of Odia texts rather than the translation of Odisha itself. The reader is not told how and in what sense Odisha can be or has been translated. We have missed the wood for the trees. In popular parlance, the term translation refers to the activity of converting a text from one language, named the source language, into a text in another language, the target language, while preserving its meaning. Unfortunately, the translated text can never convey precisely the same meaning as the source language text because of the gaps between the two languages. Firstly, the source language generally has a different lexicon, that is, stock of words, from the target language, although some words could be the same. Words are the primary instruments through which meanings are conveyed. And if the source language text contains words that are not found in the target language, their meanings will naturally diverge. More important than the individual words are the syntactic patterns used to form sentences in the two languages. If the words forming a sentence are arranged in a different order, the meaning can change entirely. Consider, for example, the two replies given below to the following question. And my question is, does Raghu go to the cinema every Sunday? That's the question. Does Raghu go to the cinema every Sunday? The first reply is, oh yes, he goes there. And the second reply is, oh yes, there he goes. Now, all that has changed here is, he goes there changes to there he goes. You see, the order of the words has changed, but it conveys a very different meaning now. because of the difference in the word order. The first one, he goes there, is simply a statement of fact, whereas the second one becomes a comment or a criticism, which may be either approval or disapproval. It could also be the difference in meaning could also be caused by a difference in the tone used by the speaker. We have looked at only two of the several possible factors that can contribute to the failure of translation. So, as a number of critics have pointed out, translation, in fact, is an impossibility. It's impossible to translate from one language to another language, you see, because of the vast differences between languages. So, in fact, attention has now moved away from the linguistic side of translation. You see, we no longer think of translation as a linguistic exercise, something that involves language, going from one language to another. And the emphasis now seems to be more on other things like the cultural aspects of the two languages. So when you talk of translation today, we are talking of more about the underlying culture that separates the two languages. But when you talk of the culture of what? A place? Is it a place like Odisha? Is it a race? Or shall we call it a nation? A tribe? What do we call Odisha? You see, we have difficulty in defining it, Odisha. So whatever it is, whether it's a place, a part of a country, whether it's a nation by itself, ultimately that is what we have to translate. You see, whether we talk about translating its culture or its language or text in that language, it is at the core of it is Odisha. So we are translating Odisha really. How can we translate Odisha? Is it possible? What is the meaning of translating Odisha? We have looked at only two of the possible factors that can contribute to the failure of translation. Meanings are not static objects permanently attached to words. They are treacherous things and need to be negotiated carefully. So meanings keep on changing, you see, which is why one has to be very careful when you're dealing with meanings. Linguistic translation has been practiced for thousands of years because it caters to an important social need. If we lived in a pre-Babylonian society, that is a society which existed before the Tower of Babel was built, we trace back all translation to the building of the Tower of Babel. Before this tower was built, all human beings, it is said, spoke the same language. But once the tower was built, it became necessary to translate. Now, if you think of a pre-Babylonian society where everyone speaks the same language, there would be no need for translation. But in the real world, translation is a necessity despite all its limitations. We have to struggle to understand each other. In the past, translation served an interpersonal function. I'm saying that in the past, translation was always something that happened between two or more people, among two or more people. You see, two people had to interact in order for translation to take place, forming a bridge between individuals and groups. But that no longer exists. That situation no longer exists. So today I am claiming translation does not have to be a social activity as it was in the past. You see, in the past we translated because we needed to interact between two groups two social groups or two individuals. See? But that has changed. You don't need human translators when gadgets are available to do the work. That's another thing that we have to cope with. Do we really need translators? You see, now we have machines which can do the work and more accurately and more reliably than any human beings. So is translation still relevant? But over and above that, the essential meaning of the term translation appears to have changed. It has become an asocial activity. It's not a social activity anymore. Something that you do by yourself and for yourself. Most of the time you translate alone, you translate when nobody else is there, and you do it for yourself, not for anyone else, without the cooperation of others. In fact, it is something that happens. See, if you think of the translation of Odisha, is anyone translating Odisha? Doesn't have to be. See, this kind of translation takes place automatically. And then what do we mean by translation? That is what I'm trying to come to now. It is something that happens without human intervention. Today, translation has to be an interpretative activity. By translation, you mean interpretation today. So translating Odisha basically means interpreting Odisha. For whom? To whom? I would say primarily yourself. See, I as an individual, I as an Odia, have to understand Odisha. My whole being depends on it. If I don't understand Odisha, if I don't belong, I don't exist. So it's very important for me to understand what is it, the race, the culture, the language, the ethos of the people. See, no one has answered this question as yet. When we are translating, we say, there is something essential that we have to preserve. Even if you lose everything else, when you're translating from the source language to the target language, you may lose everything else. But the important thing, the essential thing, has to be preserved. And no one has so far told us what is that essential thing that must be preserved. Is it the soul of the work that you're translating, the spirit, the essence? You know, you can use all kinds of words, but no one knows what exactly you're trying to convey. Translating Odisha would, in my opinion, require the translator to develop a thorough understanding of and empathy with the culture of present-day Odisha. And that in turn would require in-depth knowledge of Odisha's history. I'm claiming that if you have to translate Odisha, and you have to translate Odisha to be an Odia, to be able to call yourself an Odia, you have to translate Odisha. And that means essentially interpreting Odisha to yourself. And that requires understanding, knowledge, empathy with Odisha. So the idea of someone claiming to have translated Odia without being able to read, write, or speak the language is incomprehensible to me. More than one person has called himself a translator without knowing the language. I'm not suggesting that translation in the sense of trying to understand, assimilate, and interpret the spirit of a place, a race, or a culture will render obsolete the traditional kind of translation which has been going on for 4,000 years. The translation of books will go on, will continue. But I would perhaps say that the sense in which I am using the word translation could be thought of as a pre-translation activity. This is something that you have to do to prepare yourself to translate texts from one language to another language. It is important for us to prepare ourselves to understand social and cultural which have overtaken the world in the last 50 years or so. The world is changing fast. Odisha is changing. We have to try to understand the change. And that is where the process of translating Odisha has to come in. The confusion and bewilderment must end. You see, we're all living in confusion. I don't have time, but I think if we went a little bit into history, there's some very interesting insights which we could. You know, when Madhusudan Das joined the freedom movement, and in fact, he was one of the pioneers of the freedom movement. It's around the year 1868, I think, or 65. And that was the time when people like Gokhale, Tilak, and so on were also leading the freedom movement. Now, one of Madhusudan's close friends was the Bengali, the leader of Bengal, I'm forgetting the name now, Mukherjee. Now, Mukherjee invited Madhusudan to come and join the Congress party. And Madhusudan said, no, my first priority has to be Odisha. I have come here to make Odisha free. And only after that I can think about things, you see. Now, if one were to do that today, he would be accused of being provincial, being arrogant, and all that, you see. But at that time, perhaps it was necessary to give first priority to Odisha. I'd like to raise the question, is it possible for someone to be a good Indian without first being a good Odia? You see, to be an Odia, you have to belong to a particular place. To be an Indian, where do you belong? To which part of the country? One author after another has written about the idea of India. India is an idea, an abstract concept. You see? It's not an actual piece of territory, whereas Odisha is. So in that sense, Madhusudan Das, since the time of Madhusudan Das, Odisha has changed a lot in the last 50 years. Again, I don't have time to go into that. But you know, there was a time when the Odia language was in danger. See? It would have disappeared. You and I would not be able to speak Odia. Yeah? But it was people like Fakirwan Senapati and to some extent Madhusudan Das who came to the rescue of Odisha. So the fact is that our world has been transformed, translated. We are living in a translated world. Old values and concepts have disappeared. The old paradigms have disappeared as well. Translating books that represent our age is like holding the mirror to one's own face so that others can admire you. But are we able to recognize ourselves in the mirror? Today's world is different from the one which gave birth to so many of our most prized social institutions. You know, things that are important for us. They have come up fairly recently. The family, for instance, the concept of the family was always thought of as a necessary condition for human existence. But is that the case today? Are families still considered necessary? Are love and marriage still relevant? Now babies are born in vitro, artificially. So marriage and love maybe they've become obsolete now. Many of the changes that have taken place have been brought about by spectacular, almost miraculous developments in science. People no longer require the niceties of marriage and marital love to reproduce themselves. Babies are born through in vitro fertilization and cloning. But we do not always wait for science to catch up with us. Change has become sui generis, that is, born of itself, self-generating, the new law of gravitation. Before I close, I must return to the theme of translating Odisha. It was Madhusudan Das, the maker of modern Odisha, who first had the vision that Odisha needed to be translated and could be translated. His declaration that the motherland Odisha, which had nurtured him, would always have priority over the abstract idea of Bharat Mata shocked many. Let me raise a point which may be very controversial politically. See, today it is said if you have to think of India as a whole, holistically, as a country, as a nation, with a central organization. You can't think of the country as bits and pieces joined together. Although in the Constitution of India, the nation is supposed to be what is called a federation. You see? But you have to say that you are an Indian. You can't say you are an Odia or a Bengali or whatever. If you do that, you may be accused of being unpatriotic. And who knows, you may even be put in jail. Today, the definition of nationalism has changed. It was Odisha which taught the country that you can love your own race, your language, and your culture without being accused of being unpatriotic. We often forget it was Odisha which was the first linguistic state in the country, you see, and gave birth to the idea of linguistic state. So to come back to the beginning, we have to think of translation differently, not just as translating texts, books, or poems from one language to another language. You see? That's a very superficial definition of translation. Translation is something more fundamental, something bound to the culture, the spirit, the ethos of a place. And that is why I talked about translating Odisha. I'll be very happy if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Some of the ideas raised by you were indeed poignant as well as radical. Some very shocking, yet very thought-provoking. The concept of family, the concept of love and marriage, indeed has been rendered obsolete by the drastic development of science and technology today. And I also didn't know the fact that Odisha was the first linguistic state to have developed. It's news to me. So I would like to open the forum for questions. Really interesting questions I'm very sure people must be having. Anybody who has questions can open their camera, unmute their mics and introduce themselves and then ask a question directly to sir. Or you might even post your questions on the chat bot if you want. Or any thoughts on sir's talk? I personally think it's a paradox, Bikram sir, that it's not possible for someone to be a good Indian without being a good Odia or, in fact, any other state member. But if others are not coming forward with any questions as of yet, we'd like to buy some time for them. In the meanwhile, let me squeeze in one of my stupid questions. I would want you to elaborate on what is your thought regarding the last thing that you said, that language translation from one one language from another language, that is superficial. It is something more fundamental, which is beyond culture and the ethos. Would you like to elaborate on that? I'd like to have a grasp of that idea.
Uh, See, we are living in an age where we're struggling to discover identity, or I should say identities, plural. Who am I? What am I? Who are you? Who are the others? Who is everyone else? So I think also the question of the society in which I'm living, the society to which I belong, the community to which I belong, does it have a recognizable identity? If so, what makes Odisha? What constitutes Odisha? See, this is a question that is, what constitutes any community? See, in a way, this is a return to the old idea that what are we? Are we races? Are we tribes? What do we call ourselves? People who, the first community which came and settled somewhere, a small group of people. People were united by the ideal of communication. That is what makes human beings different from animals. But it has been found, interestingly, there is a limit to the people who can form a communicating group. There's something called Dunbar's number, named after the anthropologist Dunbar, who came up with the idea of groups. It seems not more than 200 people can constitute a community. The moment you have more than 200, the community will break up. It will shatter. There's a limit. So it means that the whole idea of nationhood. That it's really a 19th century idea, isn't it? Before the 19th century, no one thought of nations. It was always groups, races, tribes, and so on. So in a sense, we're going back to that concept of small, limited, coherent, united groups of people. So it's probably in that sense that we are trying to discover what is Odisha, what is the place, what is the culture to which I belong. It's very important for me to know that culture. You see, I can tell you, being an Odia, I was born outside Odisha. When I came back to my own state, it was a real shock for me to discover what I had been missing. It was as if the culture was there inside me, waiting, struggling to come out, struggling to express itself. I learned to read and write Odia at the age of 25. I could speak Odia, but I had learned to read or write Odia. So it's very important. These things are very important. We don't understand how important they are. So it's in that sense, I think, that we go back to the idea of translating Odisha. It is a metaphor, of course, translating Odisha. Translation itself is a metaphor. What makes human beings different from animals is the capacity to translate. By translation, I mean turning ordinary things into symbols. Man is a symbol-making animal. If you didn't create symbols,
Yeah.
you would be just another beast. So the whole idea of looking at these metaphors, finding ourselves, discovering ourselves, we haven't really thought in those lines. And it came to me, this idea came to me from my recent reading. Of course, everyone is not, in a sense, repudiating the old idea of translating books. Whether your translation has to be a faithful translation or a beautiful translation, or both. It's a minor question. It's a petty question. But how deep are you able to go? It's a subterranean kind of truth that you're ultimately trying to discover. I must say, my ideas at the moment are not very clear to me, you see. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to work something out.
Thank you. That was insightful. I think I got some idea about what you meant by it's totally more fundamental than just a superficial way of language translating from one medium to the other. Ananya Biswal, she's I think one of our students. She asks you to enlighten her with the influence of West Bengal in the linguistics of Odisha.
It's a very controversial question, isn't it? You know that Odia has been given the status of a classical language. There are certain criteria by which classical languages are defined. That these are languages which are not derived from other Indian languages. So in that sense, it has been said, the experts have decided that Bengali is not yet a classical language, whereas Odia is. Does that make us superior? I'm not sure.
think so.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, Bengal and Odisha have been two. It's a very odd kind of relationship that exists between us. You see, we are like members of the same family who can never see eye to eye with each other.
So true.
The Bengalis at one time had declared that Odia was not a language, but a dialect of Bengali. So has Bengali influenced Odia, or has Odia influenced Bengali? Well, they both come from the same root. So really the question is unnecessary, irrelevant in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's not fight over that, because there is no answer.
All right, sir. We have another question from Mary Mohanty. She asks, how is translation considered a metaphor? She wants you to explain that.
I would want to replace the word translation by transformation, or even substantiation. You see, when you're translating something, you're completely transforming it from one thing, one object into another. It's not only a change of medium, it's a change of substance as well. See? So I think we have to go much deeper. And in that sense, it is a kind of metaphorizing, that making of metaphors that we do through translation. I don't know if that answers your question.
I hope it does answer Mary Mohanty's question. I have another question from Professor Pati. She wants you to enlighten us on the ways you adopted to preserve meaning while using most appropriate forms of language.
I'm not sure if meanings have been or can be completely preserved. This is an imaginary portal that you can translate from Odia to Bengali or vice versa, but you have to keep the meaning intact. How can you? You see, It's like this. If I read a book, say Gopinath Mahanti's Harijan, which I've just translated, the Harijan was written by Gopinath Mahanti in response to a certain moral or aesthetic experience that he underwent. I would say it's a very shocking book. It's a horror-raising book, I would say. See, I don't know, in Sanskrit we have the rasa theory. You must all have heard of it. You know, there are nine rasas.
Nine rasas, yeah.
Now, one of the rasas
Adbhuta.
is what is called vibhatsa rasa.
Bibhatsa.
Vibhatsa. There is, of course, karuna rasa, this, that, and the other, all very pleasant things. But vibhatsa, the word vibhatsa means disgusting. That which creates horror, hatred. Now, how can that be a rasa in literature? Can you really create literature out of horror or out of disgust? Well, the only other piece of literature I can think of is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if you remember this text even now. I do. This is about 50 years after I read it. You remember his voice to Brobdingnag,
Yes.
where he comes across a race of people who are 50 feet or more in height, tall in height. And he says he is invited to go and have a look at the women. They're all supposed to be great beauties. But when he looks at them from close, from a close distance, he's so disgusted. He's so shocked. That's. I can't think of anything in English literature which is more, what shall I say, harrowing, more gut-wrenching than that. He said, "My God!" I mean, looked at the pustules and the pimples on their faces, and they're seen from a very close distance. Now, in Harijan, this is exactly what Gopinath Mahanti does. I wonder how many of you have read the book Harijan. I do a kind of informal survey from time to time, and I found that hardly anyone that I know, hardly anyone that I run into, has read Harijan, which is one of his great books, if you ask me. The Harijan is the story of a group of manual scavengers, people who earn their living by removing shit. Let's not call it, try to call it by a more defined name, by moving shit with their fingers, lifting it, carrying it on their heads, and depositing it elsewhere. Now, you know that the law against manual scavenging was passed only about 20 years ago. Until then, manual scavenging was not considered illegal. It is practiced even now, although in theory it is illegal. People are dying from time to time. You read of, I think today's paper had a report, but to a mother and a son who was asphyxiated by the gas coming out of a sewer. So people who have to earn their living by carrying our excreta, that's Harijan. So what kind of society would permit that? Do we need such a society? Must it not be translated?
Yeah.
So yes, there is so much to learn from the work that great writers have done.
Doesn't this resonate Mulkraj Anand's The Untouchable, like in the theme?
Mulkraj Anand's Untouchable is a piece of cake, a piece of ice cream. In comparison with other books on manual scavenging, I've read about 5 of them, apart from Harijan. There's a book in Malayalam.
Okay.
I think in English translation it's called The Scavenger's Son. You see, I don't have time to go into the story now, but it's another horror, another tale of horror. You see, so in comparison, Mulkraj Anand, by the way, he was a great friend of Virginia Woolf and a member of the Bloomsbury Group.
Bloomsbury Group.
Bloomsbury Group. He came to India to meet Mahatma Gandhi and asked him to recommend Untouchable. But Mahatma Gandhi was too smart for him. And he said, oh, that's all right. That's a good book. Go ahead. So, yeah, Mulkraj Anand is not one of my favorite authors.
We have another question. There are lots of questions now that have been piling up for you. Nikita Suman asks you, she wants you to guide her in the ways, what are the ways a student can begin engaging with Odisha's history and then contribute to translation? It's a very practical question. Yeah.
I think it's very important if you really are interested in Odia, in translating from Odia, which is very much worth doing. You see, Odia is a language which has been totally grossly under translated. You see, and I don't know. I've had the experience, unfortunately, of having one book after another turned down by publishers. You know, because they said this is an Odia book. Who will read it? This is a translation of an Odia book. So I had to wait 18 years before Paraja was accepted as for translation. But yes, Odia, I think the right books need to be translated. And I hope the Translation Center will not insist on only what it calls life writing. But there are umpteen good books, good literary books, waiting to be translated in Odia. But yes, before one takes up translation, it's very important to know the language, of course, the nuances of the language. You know, Gopinath Mahanti uses words which no other Odia writer has ever used, you see. And when I was translating Harijan, I found a certain word. I asked so many people, I said, what does it mean? Not one person could enlighten me. And finally, I discovered this was a word used only in one village in Cuttack district, you see, which Gopinath Mahanti had observed, and he'd written it down in his notebook. You see. So yes, you have to make a thorough study of the language, the culture, the food. Everything is relevant. You see, you can't be a translator without knowing Odia.
So that means thorough reading, acquaint yourselves with a lot of reading
Lot of
in the
reading. Know
language.
the history of Odisha. Odisha doesn't have a good history.
Right.
Yes. There is no reliable history of Odisha. So I think we need the background information. And the more you read, I think the more you will learn.
Yeah, I had come across a Odia history book by Mayadhar Mansingh. I don't know how far that will be helpful for
No,
people who are
I wouldn't.
enthusiastic. No?
I wouldn't swear by it.
Okay.
Yeah. There are a few good books, but by and large, Odia historians tend to be so romantic. You see, they don't bother about the truth. Anyway,
On
it's a
that
national.
same on
Yeah.
that same note, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, please.
On that same note, Mary Mohanty wants you to elaborate on the Odia literary text that you would suggest for translation.
Well, all of Kanu Mahanti is waiting to be translated. Gopinath Mahanti's brother.
Okay.
There is also Nero Sarla by Surendra Mahanti, which should be translated, deserves to be translated. But there are many lesser known books which one has to try and explore. And there are so many unknown things in the village culture, the rural culture of Odisha. For example, Lakshmi Purana was discovered, by one translator and translated. It made a huge impact. So yes, you have to explore. You have to explore. Don't just sit in your library and translate.
Sure. I have one last question for you. This is by Ashutosh Biswal. He wants to know whether we lose the essence of translated to a different language, and how far is it possible on part of the translator to give justice to a translation?
I wish somebody would define what is meant by the word essence. What is the essence of a book? Which part of the book is its essence? I've come to the conclusion after I've translated about a dozen books from Odia into English that you can never do what is called a faithful translation because your voice has to come through. You can't remain invisible. Even if you are invisible, you have to be audible.
Yeah.
So, well, after all, the translation is at least partly yours. It may be mostly the author's work, but some of it belongs to you as well.
Yeah.
It reflects you. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
It might bring in more subtexts and more flavor to the
It's
text
inevitable. It will come in. You can't avoid it.
Yeah. That's right. Great. I don't see any more questions. Yeah, I have one more, sir. One more before we let you go.
Okay.
Soumya Shefali is asking, do you think the source language suffers a loss during the translation?
Depends on what you mean by loss. Why not a little gain as well? You see? I think Odia has been enriched in the process of translation. In its interaction with other languages, surely it must have picked up something. Now, there will be some change, I don't know. You can use the word loss if you like. Yes, it's inevitable. Something will change in the process of translation, and I think something will be gained as well. So I don't think we should have any regrets about that. I think every language has gained in the long run, by allowing itself to be translated.
Of course. I think that is all we had for you in terms of questions.
Thank you.
I was a lot of questions came in, and I hope you are equally happy to answer them and that you
Yeah,
enjoyed our
I'm
session.
happy that there were questions. I was afraid there might not be.
I was afraid of the same, but then thankfully people really joined in and got in the spirit of it.
Thank you very much, sir. This is Madhusmita here back again.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this talk, and we really got to know certain things, like you talked about empathy and you talked about change, and change is sui generis, and when we are into that act of translation, how these points also ought to be kept in mind, and how the activity of translating is actually is an interpretative activity. So
By the way,
translating Odisha
Madhusmita,
was interpreting Odisha. So
Yeah.
that's the
But,
point we get from your talk. Yes, sir.
by the way, the point I've been trying to make is I feel you ought not to limit yourself to only what is called life writing. I'm not very sure I understand what is the definition of life writing,
Okay,
but
sir.
why should we exclude creative writing or imaginative writing from this genre of life writing? I agree that there must be also this is a totally neglected area. I agree.
Yes, that is
But
one of the reason, and we also wanted to focus on a particular area. Like if we just have left it to translation, it would have done us a lot good. But like by just focusing on life writing, we are able to focus on a particular area. We are able to as you said, it's a neglected area. It's a much less known area of research and of interest to the people. But that does not imply that there is dearth of life writings in Odisha. Like biographies, we have compiled a bibliography now, and it has more than 1,000 books at present. Autobiography more than 350. So it's a very it's a particular subgenre where a lot of people are writing, but we are not giving much of attention to it, and that is the reason we have taken up life writing as something that we would like to focus on. And by life writing here, we can bring in the marginals, we can bring in from writing from the colonial times, writing from the contemporary times, and like we can spread across different areas and different time zone also,
yeah.
and we can do it. So, and this is like Odia literature is rich with life writing, and that is
No,
what
I
we
agree.
wanted
I
to
fully
focus
agree
on.
with that. You see, like some time ago, I believe Utkal University, your department, no, the Utkal University had started a project of this kind. They were translating what you would call life writing, but I was waiting to see the results that emerged from this. Nothing happened. There was no work which one got to see. So
So you
I was
come over here to our center, and you can see there are two. We have young people. You met Sarbani now, and there are other young people. PDF. We have postdoctoral fellows, research assistants, and they are making the center very vibrant. And I know it's because of Corona you're not able to visit us, and we have been eagerly waiting that things should really become normal, and we should be able to
No,
invite you.
it's a very good thing that you're doing life writing,
Yes,
but please don't totally ignore creative writing
creative
or
writing also. So
because
yes,
that also needs to be done.
focus. Yes, yes. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. Maybe we'll apply for another center where we will focus on translation and the rest of the things. This
No, I
is
mean,
like
what's wrong with just calling it translation?
just call it translate, because we wanted to be very specific and certain. That we just wanted to be specific. They just didn't want to spread across a lot, so that we wanted
Okay.
to contribute something into or do something in an area which gets very less attention.
Right. You pays the piper, you calls the tune.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. And it was indeed a pleasure to have you with us. And we will look forward to many other occasions like this where we can get your mentorship, and we'll go forward. We'll think of how to incorporate creative writing also into our activity, into our job. Thank you
Thank you.
very much, sir. Thank you. It was
Thank
indeed a
you
great
for
pleasure.
thank you.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all the participants for being here.
Yes, I must also thank them.
Yes, thank
Right.
you. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
রেকর্ডিং
ଚାଲିଛି ଅଫ୍ କଲେ